Obedience to God comes before obedience to men. All of us at different times in our life have probably come to a stage whereby we want to make choices for ourselves against perhaps those in authority. Perhaps it's against institutions, perhaps it's against our own parents, perhaps teachers, employers, etc. And the church reminds us right throughout history, and it's here in the scriptures, that we're called first and foremost not to give obedience to things of the earth, but to give obedience to God. However, that can cause problems, because in many contexts, people sometimes relate obedience to God with what each person wants for themselves. And that becomes a challenge, because that may not be obedience to God. Christ taught that we need to work out what is the will of God. We're called to pray for the will of God. If everyone's just able to just know it just in 5 seconds without having to discern it, then why should we be praying for God's will be done? We need to know what God's will be done, and then we need to be able to have the courage to actually do God's will. Here we have this first reading, and we have this incredible phrase. We have the apostles have been arrested. They're now brought in front of the Sanhedrin, and they're saying, well, why are you doing this? You're not respecting us. We've told you not to go and preach about Jesus Christ, and you're doing this. And they've said obedience to God comes before obedience to men. They weren't just speaking about Jesus Christ to be revolutionary because they didn't like the Jewish high priests. That's not what's going on. They're not doing this because they want to cause some massive war or fight between the Jewish people and the Romans, or between the Jewish people and the followers of Christ. They're doing this. They're speaking about Jesus Christ because they've come to a deep knowledge of God. And when we're called to do God's will, and we're praying to do God's will, we need to discern God's will. And there's a number of ways that we do that. First of all, we need to pray in silence. It's not just the very first thing that comes into our head. Sometimes people think, sometimes that gut feeling inside our conscience might be saying what God's will is. That could be what we want, but what is God's will? So it needs to be discerned. We need to consider, what is the tradition? What has God revealed to us through the scriptures, through our community, as to what is of goodness? Then perhaps we need to talk to others as well. Before we do something drastic, talk to those around us, because that helps us to discern what God's will is. We can't just say, well, obedience to God is just, well, I want to do this and I don't care about anybody else. That's not obedience to God. That's obedience maybe to our own gut, our own self. It's a challenge for all of us, I think, at different times. What is God's will? How can we be obedient to God? So pray for that. Discern that. Discern what God's will is for you today. When we come to Mass, that should be something we're praying about. If we're true to be obedient to God, what is God's will for you in your specific context? So pray about it. Reflect about it. Look at what the commandments say, what the Beatitudes say, what does Jesus reveal to us to say, what do our particular passages today ask us to think about? The early Christians were proclaiming Jesus Christ without fear. They were courageous, even when the authorities and the institutions told them to be quiet. Let's pray that we can actually do God's will. Obedience to God comes before obedience to men. Let's pray that we will have an understanding of this. We will discern what it means to be obedient to God, and we will then put God's will into action in our own particular lives throughout the day and over the coming days.